Welcome to today's program titled Return to Business in the New York Metro Area, What Reopening Means for Institutional Building Owners and Investors. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. For those of you who are logged into the web presentation, you are encouraged to submit questions throughout the conference by typing them into the text box on your screen. For those interested in obtaining CLE credit for this webinar, an attendance verification code will be read during the presentation that will be required on the CLE attendance affirmation form. Please write this code down. It will not be reread, and it is required for CLE credit. Copies of the webinar recording and materials will be distributed to attendees in the days following the webinar. At this time, I would like to turn it over to Lori Allman. Lori, you may begin.
Thank you, and welcome everyone to our presentation today, Return to Business in the New York Metropolitan Area, What Reopening Means for Institutional Building Owners and Investors. I'd like to start today by allowing our speakers to introduce themselves. We have an incredible panel of experts here with us today, and I'll start with Dean to give him an opportunity to introduce himself.
Good morning. My name is Dean Singalani, Senior Vice President of Property Management with Mac Talley Realty Corp, and that's it.
Thank you. Toby, could you introduce yourself?
Hello, my name is Toby Dodd. I'm the President for Cushman & Wakefield across the tri-state region, leading our 5,000 people across all of our service lines, serving both our investor clients and our occupier clients. Great to be here.
Thank you for being with us. Andy?
Thanks, Lori. Thanks for having me. My name is Andy Levine, the Chief Legal Officer and General Counsel here at SL Green Realty Corp. And going on 20 years here, so it's been an exciting run. Nothing like COVID, though.
It's a new one. Gary?
Thank you. I'm Gary Wagner. I'm the General Counsel at Mac Talley. I've been with the company now for over 30 years, and I agree with Andy. And we've seen markets come and go, but this is a new one.
Thanks, Gary. John, looks like you're up next.
Okay, thanks, Lori. John Napoli. I'm a partner at Seyfarth Shaw. I've been doing real estate related work since I finished law school long ago. Practiced with Andrew Levine at one time. It was my honor. And this is quite a interesting situation, both on the landlord, tenant, and finance side. So there's a lot of, it's very challenging for everybody.
Thanks, John. Miles?
Miles Borden, a real estate partner at Seyfarth Shaw. I've worked on both the ownership side on a lot of issues, including with building management issues, and also devote a lot of time to tenant side issues.
Thanks, Miles. And finally, I'm Lori Allman. I'm a partner in our labor and employment practice. I focus on complex advice and counsel and litigation matters, and certainly the complexities around COVID-19 match any challenge that our clients have faced. I also co-manage the New York office with John and sit on our firm's executive committee and have the experience of going through this as both a lawyer giving counsel and an employer trying to navigate these complex issues. So hopefully we're all able to work together to give you some helpful insight today. Our agenda for today is up on the screen, and as you can see, we're going to talk about in no particular order, health and safety protocols that will relate to landlords and real estate issues. We'll be talking about planning ahead and creating a team and a process about the return to work in this new world we find ourselves in. We'll be covering the new abnormal, as we call it, for buildings operations, systems, and management practices. We'll be discussing capital planning and how to handle these increased expenses that are associated with COVID, and then talking about some of the additional resources that we're able to offer to our real estate industry clients and friends, and finally ending with some question and answer between our expert panelists here and everyone who's listening. So we encourage you to send us questions, and we will endeavor to answer the things that are on your mind. First, just by way of a little bit of background for our discussion, we wanted to remind everyone about New York Forward and the state's plan for reopening New York. As many of you know, the New York pause orders expired on May 15th, and the state was divided into 10 regions. 9 of 10 of those regions have now met all the preconditions for reopening and have begun a phased opening. We're seeing similar in Connecticut and New Jersey. Just this week, Hudson Valley and Long Island began their phased reopening. And New York City is hopefully soon on the cusp of that. We would expect probably in around mid to late June that we will see New York City meeting all the metrics for reopening, but of course nothing is certain in this time. The phases of reopening, they're broken into 4 separate industry-based phases, and the phases are expected to be roughly 2 weeks apart. The idea between the 2-week period is giving the government time to track and look for an increase in infections associated with reopening, but the governor may allow a shorter time between phases if there's no problematic trend after a shorter period. As many of you may know, phase 1 of the reopening is construction, retail for curbside pickup, and similar industries. Phase 2, which is probably of most relevance to this group here, is professional services, finance and insurance, retail administrative support, and real estate and rental leasing. Phase 3 relates to restaurants and food service, and at Phase 4, we'll all be attending baseball games and going back to the theaters. One of the things that the New York Forward Plan provides is that businesses must have mandatory business reopening plans. You can see the criteria listed here on this slide as to what must be contained in each of these written plans. The plans must include all of these components per the governor's executive order, and they have to be kept on premises. They do not have to be submitted for approval to the state, but landlords and employers do have to send an affirmation to the state saying that they've created a plan, and the plans have to be readily available for inspection, not only by the Department of Health, but also by employees. And as an aside, we can tell you that we have seen an enormous level of activism by employees and visitors and the like, customers, in terms of raising concerns to the government when they don't think that an entity has been compliant with the executive orders. There's a New York Forward Safety Plan template that you can reference if you go to the state's website. And you'll see that there's also this reference to cleaning and sanitation standards. Those standards also have to be documented. Compliance with those standards has to be documented. And the cleaning has to meet CDC and Department of Health rules. And at least the CDC has shown a propensity to change the standards on a very regular basis, almost every couple of days. So it's a fairly onerous obligation. Miles, I'll turn it over to you to talk about some of the policies and procedures that companies might consider.
So in putting together those plans that Lori was talking about, there's a lot of things that owners need to think about. And primarily, the overriding concern is getting everybody back to the buildings, but let's do it in a safe manner. So you need to develop items on how to control infection. So, whether that goes to screening of the building employees, be they employees of the owner or the managing agent? What are you going to do? What should you do under the law? Do you have to consider perhaps can you overstep your bounds from a liability perspective? A different set of people are tenants and visitors. What are your procedures going to be with respect to the tenant employees, to their visitors? Are there differences? How do you deal with perhaps your building vendors and contractors that are performing services throughout the building? Do you need to test them? Do you need to perhaps consider changes to your agreements with them as to liability sharing? Of course, we've all heard about things like social distancing. Well, how does that translate to the building from the, I think I'll use one of Toby's phrases, curb to desk or curb to office. What does it look like when people enter your building? Should they enter from one direction and exit out another side? What do you do with your security desk? How do you distance there? How do you queue people up? The people, in your lobby, be they security people, be they, cleaning people, what type of PPE should they use? Is it just masks? Do they need face shields? Should you put face shields up at the security desk? Meetings, how do you deal with meetings? Should they continue for a period of time, within your organization as a landlord or with your managing agent, via technology, or can you have social distance meetings? So there's a whole host of things that you have to think about in putting these plans together. And then when you answer those questions, how do you do those things? How do you screen? Are there temperature testing? Are there ways to do it, with an overhead scan? If you're going to take information people and test on people, what are the privacy concerns? Who should you share that information within a building? Say an employee of a tenant tests positive. Do you need to tell that tenant? Do you need to tell other tenants? So you need to really consider these things in developing your plan and kind of coming up with what your practical day-to-day items are going to look like. And which moves us on to kind of creating the return to the work team and your process. John, I think is it that yours?
Yes, thank you. I forgot to unmute, but this is John Napoli, and thank you. We've heard a lot of good practices. New York has some mandatory rules. Other Connecticut and New Jersey haven't quite caught up yet. That plans are in place, but it's clear that there's a lot to consider. And one of the first probably step is that we found is creating a team. And the building owner operator should develop create a team that can deal with COVID-19 response issues. In doing that, you'll have to determine whether the employees have the sufficient skill. Team needs to be well versed in understanding the rules that are in place. In New York, they tend to be laid out very well. New Jersey, Connecticut, it's a little bit more open, but there's still CDC guidelines that they should be familiar with. And it should be comprised probably of people of different backgrounds. There's a lot of different tasks involved. There's a lot of different considerations. You have employees, you have tenants, and you have guests, obviously, coming into your building, as well as independent contractors, subcontractors, and a whole host of folks that are entering into your building. So, Andy, I mean, you're the largest, I think, landlord in the city of New York. Can you tell us how you went about creating a team and some of the considerations that you took into account and how you did it?
Sure. Thanks, John. So we, early on, we created a team, and really it was all kind of started at the top. Our CEO, Mark Holliday, got involved right away. He's not on the team, so to speak, but we pulled together mostly folks from the operations and construction group. There's there's actually one or two people who are from our leasing group, but most of them, I'm just doing this a little by memory because I don't have the full team in front of me. I think it's 4 people are from the construction and operations group, which is what you'd predict, and they have been working with tenants to find out what did the tenant. I mean, now we're at the point of being ready with our plan, so not working with, but had worked with tenants, worked with some of the other owners, and worked with council to put that group to put all the programs in place. So to sum up, mostly construction and operations folks. They're the ones who are most familiar with the building and the building systems and how to modify the buildings to take on the new things we're going to be doing in the face of the coronavirus.
And I think the team, not only you got to create a team, but there's a whole process that needs to be created. Tenants, visitors, different protocols. There has to be clear understanding of where people are going, where deliveries are coming in, number of people in the lobbies, social distancing, and tenants. We also need to develop some reporting guidelines if there's positive cases, which I think happened before there was a shutdown, communicating on a permissible basis. Toby, can maybe you talk about some of the processes that you guys are recommending in the teams?
Absolutely, and just going back to Andy's earlier point about the team, I agree with everything that was said, and I would add to that, if thinking about this from a corporate tenant's perspective. What we did was we created a global task force, an Americas task force, a regional tri-state task force, which I lead, and then down to an individual office task force, which is about sort of tactical implementation. But thinking about the team at the global level, which is where the strategic decisions are being made, the people involved in that, obviously our leadership, our legal team were very much involved. Our HR team, we took external advice. We have a medical professional as part of that team, as an external provider, and then our operations teams from both the facility side and the property side. So that's sort of I just want to sort of add that to it, sort of how global companies are thinking about this, and then how that filters down to the Americas level where decisions are being made, and then down sort of my level in the region where we're making some decisions in sort of line with that sort of overarching sort of corporate guidance, and then we're getting into the sort of the real practical implementation. So if you take that to the process, and that leadership structure and those people involved leads exactly into the process. So what we developed was the Safe 6, which is a framework that can be applied globally. So whether for our investor landlord clients, whether our occupied tenant clients, the same framework can be applied. We learned a lot in the early stages of the virus from our business in China around the rest of Asia. We worked with our clients to sort of take offline and bring back online about 800 million square feet, and there's about 1 million people that work in those spaces. So one of the as we think about those processes, the Safe 6, the 6 steps. One is preparing the building. The second is preparing the workforce. The third is about controlling access to all the different people that come into the spaces, whether that's the building or the facility. Fourthly is creating social distancing plans. Again, when you enter the building, so that curb to desk experience that Miles mentioned. So how do you do that? Fifthly is reducing the number of touch points and increasing the cleaning protocols and frequencies. And then lastly, I think is probably the most important, and sort of really brings it all to life is the communication. And as we all know, that the experiences coming back to the workplace is going to be very different to what we left. And I see this as a huge collaborative effort between the owners of the building and the tenants within the building. I think everybody is coming together to form a real partnership. I mean, we all have so many wonderful experiences being in the office, socializing with colleagues, the culture that we build, the mentorship, all of that sort of good stuff. So there is a real desire for people to come back. So all of this effort is around creating an environment, a warm and welcoming environment to come back. And obviously, the first part of that starts with when you step off the sort of the pavement into the building. The experience that the landlord creates, making it that warm and welcoming experience from people when they've sort of finished that commute, all the way into their spaces that when they're actually in their office for their facilities teams to manage. So in terms of the process, that's really sort of the framework we created. And then as you go from sort of that macro level down to the individual offices, it's the actual implementation of that, bringing it to life. Every office is slightly different. But within the Safe Six we created, it sort of documents a process for people to follow. Again, end goal is health and safety and really happiness of the people who are going to come back to the buildings and come back to the offices.
Great. Thank you, Toby. And, one of the things that you said, I think, is very important, and that is communication. That involves tenants, people entering the building, leaving the building. I'm wondering if...
And it's vendors and contractors as well, John.
Right.
So,
Harry, I was just going to turn to you and ask if you could talk about the communication that you have, different groups of people, you and Dean.
Sure. Let me start, going back to earlier point. Although New Jersey doesn't have more of the written in stone requirements that maybe FOMO and New York has. We have formed a team here consisting of virtually people from every department in the company, and it's a team that overlaps not just what we're doing for our tenants, but our own back to work strategy and protocol. And so we're I'll say the same group is kind of dealing with both sides of the coin. I'll speak to what we're doing as far as employees, and Dean can. I'll hand it off to Dean. He could talk about what we're doing with our tenants and perhaps our vendors as well. With respect to our employees, we're kind of gearing up, figuring that within the next, hopefully, short weeks, that we'll have our employees back to work. We prepared a communication listing things like what the protocols will be upon their arrival, what kind of scheduling adjustments that we may look to implement at this point. We've never been a half-day Friday shop, or haven't been for many years. We're looking maybe to go 4-day a week. I mean, it's things that we're looking at, nothing decided yet, but these are the kinds of things, maybe just adjusting shifts so that we're not, our offices are pretty spread out now. We're pretty good at that, but to the extent that we do have employees that are sitting where we think are too close together in cubicles, we'll look to rejigger it a little bit so that that there's the proper social distancing and everybody feels comfortable. I think one of the things you kind of have to take a common sense approach to this, in that when the employees are coming back to work, what do they want? They want to feel comfortable. They want to feel confident that that we have a plan in place, that they're not to do the best that we can to that they don't get sick. So it's going to involve all, I'll say, the common sense things. We have signs, well, remember to wash your hands. Masks are an issue because certainly people in their own offices, nobody wants to wear a mask all day, let's face it. And people in their offices are not going to wear a mask. But what are we going to do about people, sitting in cubicles? And that may, I think that's, something that will require, further discussion. Certainly we'll let them know about our up-to-date cleaning procedures and so forth. They're going to see more cleaning personnel around when they come to work and to the building anyway. Another issue for employees is food. How are we going to get our employees fed and get the building as a whole, all our buildings, frankly. How are we going to get lunch delivered? So we're going to, work to get at least our local. We have a lot of food in the buildings, and so we'll get that in a way that the food gets to the offices themselves. So there's less congregations in the lobbies and so forth. We'll certainly communicate that to our tenants in the buildings as well. And as far as front desk, we have signs now. We're going to be putting up more signs. We have in our main building, in Harborside Complex, we have a large atrium that's really open to the public. It's an access way to the ferry. So we'll have signage, the floor signs, maintain social distancing, that kind of thing. And again, I think just, John, what you said about communication is really the thing. Just letting people know what's expected and make them feel comfortable when they come in. Dean?
Well, Gary, that's a lot to take in. There's a lot of different parameters as it relates to operations of the properties. And through this whole pandemic, each day you learn a little more. Things come across the wire as far as what we should be doing, what we shouldn't be doing. So we've taken the approach during this was, we have our engineers, and we've taken and we've shifted them. So we'll have a crew on for a week, another crew on for another week. Anybody who has reported not feeling well or comes down with COVID, those people would be isolated for the 14 days. So we've been handling it that way. As far as the systems go, we split teams up. We have a in-house mechanical engineer who's been assisting us with a lot of the new ASHRAE provisions and trying to work through the meanings of them and how to change our sequence of operation on our systems. Some of the low-hanging fruit, we've already gone around, and where you have kitchenettes in our tenant spaces, we've been running the water making sure the coffee makers, ice machines, anything of that nature, we're flushing out. So when the tenants do come back, they don't have moldy, stale water and something else to deal with. Communication is the real thing. Our processes, we're probably about 99% done on most of our processes, but we're waiting for, CDC and the governor's orders as they come through to figure out exactly what everything is going to take place and how we have to make some of the changes. As far as operational and mechanical systems, ASHRAE.
Toby, we're going to get into some of that a little later. I think that the point is that it's communication and transparency, and it's a evolving process. And I think that which segues us into the next really aspect, which is the new abnormal. And
so we started to flow into the new abnormal anyway, and I think this is the more exciting part of this whole webinar. And so just to sort of reiterate quickly on communication, it's about getting tenants back in the building, as we said, in a very comfortable manner, coordinating with them. I think it would be a good idea to reach out to tenants to see if they have, special needs. So what kind of pops to mind, specialty tenants that maybe are in somehow related to the healthcare industry, whether they're doctors' offices or things like that, or tenants in the restaurant or food business. Are they going to be serving sort of outside of the premises, whether it's on the street? How does that affect the building? How are we going to deal with congregations of people whose responsibilities are there? So there's, I'm sure each tenant will have their own unique issues. Some buildings have amenities such as gyms or food service areas. Will they reopen? What will that reopening look like? So again, there's coordination with tenants on a lot of levels, including on what will safety precautions look like, fire drill procedures and things like that. I think that, it comes down to and Lori, I think safety and sort of risk allocation a little bit between the landlord and tenant. Were you going to say a few things on that?
Sure. Yeah. So one of the pieces that comes with all this, of course, is the risk of liability if landlords don't get this right, or if they're perceived not to get this right. And there's a lot of nervous people, and frankly, a lot of remedies available under the law for perceived failure to comply with the myriad of COVID orders, guidance, directives, Department of Health guidelines, CDC guidelines, WHO guidelines. So one of the trick is where everyone's trying to do the right thing, but none of us even knew about these rules three months ago, and you've got a lot of very nervous members of the public and employees and visitors who are going to be looking for fingers to point if things are not handled in the way that they think are appropriate. They, too, are learning about rules from newspaper reports that may or may not be accurate. So it's just a real sort of petri dish, I guess, for the growth of potential legal claims. And so one of the things that we wanted to recommend to all of you is that all the legal considerations and who's responsible for what be a real focal point of your planning. There are lots of ways in which risk can be allocated and lots of things that can create risk. And so we simply encourage you to think about that risk allocation when it comes to leases, when it comes to signage, when it comes to assumption of risk upon entry of a physical space. And really knowing who's responsible for what and who's making sure we're compliant with what we need to do is going to be really critical at this time.
Great. Dean, if you would, I think you started to talk about sort of the practical things in terms of systems and what's being considered in buildings. I think it's a good point, if you would, to kind of go back, and we'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Okay. So we've gone back and we've listened to what ASHRAE has suggested, and they're going to come out with probably more information as this thing carries on. But currently, we're changing out all our filters to MERV 13s where we can, and where we're doing modifications, we're doing those modifications. And obviously, a lot of the people may be aware of it, that, obviously when you change filters, you do put a different load condition on your equipment, and some of it may work through the summer months, some of it may not. So those are things that, we have to find out, and you can get an engineer in to evaluate it. But on the majority of them, we're seeing that we should be okay. Run times, during this, we have been running our equipment. Early on, we went into raising the discharge temperatures and opening up outside air to make as many air changes as we could. We've also had the cleaning staff at night and during the day convert to all touch point areas. And since, we had minimal amount of occupants in the building, you had people still coming in on the IT servers, people just checking their offices out, getting equipment, files. But we would go in, and every night we would hit all the touch points and do high-end detailed cleaning. So that's, when the tenants were concerned about coming in, we were able to tell them that this is what we're doing. We've also taken on looking at ionization, UV lighting, blue box, coil cleaning type measures, and those are all being weighed out as far as the availability, the installation time, and the practicality of doing all this stuff. I think it's very hard for any operator or owner to go in and start adding on some of the bigger equipment all at once. We got to really evaluate it and see what is the best system to put into play. Because once we do it, we want to go in with like one system. We don't want to have multiple systems out there. Purchasing power, maintenance-wise, things of that nature. We want to just have it one type of system. As far as the staff, we have meetings probably every 2 days to discuss what we're doing, and that's with our third-party engineering staff, our supervisors, our property management staff. We also have the suburban and waterfront assets, so a lot of the stuff blends together, but some of the things on the waterfront where we have the high-rise are different. Another item that hasn't been talked about much is fire evac. What we're going to do once the tenants come back in and there is a fire situation, a smoke situation, alarms go off. So we're going to be meeting with all of the tenant wardens on a probably weekly basis just to make sure that they've notified all the people as they come back in. If you have any individuals that have any type of handicap situation, we're going to make sure that there's teams available to assist them. And that's, basically the roundabout flavoring of it. I don't want to get into too much detail because I think a lot of people on the call understand the systems. They have their engineering group, and we're pretty much doing all the same things out there. That's about it, I would say.
Yep. Gary or Toby or Andy, what have your thoughts been on in terms of what is the critical staff? How do you get to those decisions? Is there thought as to how rough somebody's commute is? How you sort of
Miles, I'm happy to sort of talk to that. So let me just first of all, sort of that point around this is a partnership, I think, between owners of buildings and the tenants of buildings. I think this is a partnership. I actually sort of look at the commuting part of this as sort of almost like the civic duty of all employers to sort of do their part and sort of reduce density. So sort of overarching, we've tried to create a framework and a plan that is with limited capital and can be done quickly. Like we're not in any way sort of advocating that people should be going and deploying a lot of capital to their buildings, and we don't want any of these things to take a lot of time. So we should be able to get your buildings and your facilities up and running really, really quickly. When we think about from our perspective of putting that flexibility in individual team members' hands, employees' hands, we are going to make it voluntary for people to come back in the first phase, so people can choose whether they want to come back or whether they don't want to come back. They're productive and they're happy at home. And we're going to limit the occupancy in our office to 25%. And so that those 2 points I made at the start about civic duty and partnership. So I think civic duty, if we're only bringing 25% of our people back in the first phase, then that's a significant reduction on the amount of people just from our firm who are using public transport. And then also, it's less people for the owner of the building to have to manage coming in and out of the building. So that's sort of how I think about that. Enabling those things is, we're going to provide full PPE to all of our team members. So, when they're commuting, if it's on the subway, or however, whether it's bus, they have gloves, they have masks, they have sanitizer, they have all of those things, to feel sort of, safe through that journey. When we sort of get into sort of more granular stuff, thinking about just like the cleaning in the building. So no doubt once we do come back, there's going to be an increase in the frequency of cleaning and the materials that we're going to be using. And also, so that's going to sort of add to the expenses. The other thing is, we think that there's probably going to be a wash for this year. So let's say that increase in cleaning is going to be 50 cents a dollar a square foot, which is going to add to the operating expense of the building, which is going to be passed through the tenant. We think it's probably going to be a wash because expenses have probably been reduced during this period where we're all in this work from home environment. But obviously going forward, that's going to change. As people sort of expect a different cleaning standard. But again, I come back to that point of like, this is all about open communication, collaboration between the owners and the occupiers of buildings.
Great, thank you. So as we just touched upon the surfaces and hand sanitation and cleaning, and we talked a bit about optimizing air quality control, but John, I'll turn it over to you to add anything here or get information from our esteemed panelists.
Thanks. And this is obviously is going to be landlord by landlord, but there is some concern about air quality, how to minimize the effect, the droplets. Do you increase the outside air? Do you open windows? Do you have horizontal or upward airflow? If you do, does that affect the viral spread? And some buildings are old and some buildings are new, and so there's a lot to this, and I think that it's going to have to depend on the space, the year when the building was built. Where do you use plexiglass or physical separations? Do you shields, enclosed offices? I think we touched on it. I don't know that we should dwell on it very much. If I don't know if Andy or Gary want to add anything to that, or Dean.
No, John. The only thing I'd like to, I think it'd be interesting to talk about a little bit. And Andy, when we talked, I guess on Tuesday, was it? Tuesday. We talked about temperature taking of people in the building and that kind of thing. And I thought that was actually kind of interesting. So if I recall, you guys plan on taking temperatures of people coming into the building?
Well, so the answer is yes, but we're not going to have we're going to, at least the current plan is to utilize overhead temperature scanners, which are fairly heavily in use in Asia, is my understanding, and so the efficacy of the technology is there, and it's pretty successfully employed overseas. We're going to use it in our buildings. We think it is important to not only just tenants, but all the employees and visitors coming into the building. We're not doing it just for show by no means. We think it's the right message to give to the entire population that this is something we take seriously. We know our tenants want it. We know our visitors want it. We want people to believe it's a safe environment. So the use of the overhead will give us at least an immediate indication of who may be showing up on the technology as having a temperature above, I think the CDC threshold is 100.4. You know, with guidance, quite frankly, from Seyfarth, we're making sure what we do with that information, really just to the people who are, you know, I'll use the word hot, that it's obviously never discriminatory, but it's making sure people appreciate what's going on within themselves and what's going on to the people around them, and in a discreet way let them know and letting our tenants know. So back to the whole issue of communication, you know, we all talk about making sure communication goes out to a wide audience. It's also critical to be communicating discreetly to the people that are coming and going into the building for them to appreciate about their own, you know, factors, what's going on, and you know, it's then a short step to the other lobby protocols we're having in terms of face masks, no congregating, elevator proctors to make sure that the elevators are used properly, limited number of people, and efficiently, because, you know, one of the big questions everyone has is vertical transportation. So, you know, it starts with the overhead scanners, and then flows through to a bunch of other attributes which we think are the right ones to have for our buildings and communicate to really everyone who's coming and going.
Yeah, and Andy, I'll just note that those overhead scanners, we're hearing that is a big part of the reopening plan of amusement parks and ballparks and the like. So I think it's going to be part of this new abnormal for all of us to start seeing that on a pretty widespread basis. John, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was just going to add that, you know, safe buildings make tenants feel safe, and you know, probably you know, makes it a more attractive building. So, you know, you know, I think that's going to maybe be the wave of the future. That may be one of those things that stick with every crisis. Something stick. You know, we had 9/11. Before 9/11, we could walk in any building in New York without showing our ID or this or that, and push the button and go up. And then 9/11 came, and all these things became the new normal. And this may be one of those things.
You know, John, what's important? Oh, Lord, sorry. What's important is for building owners like ourselves to also make sure that we are being smart and efficient. And I know, I think it was Toby or maybe Dean who talked about, you know, the pass along cost to tenants. There's a whole lot of new costs. We are investing a ton of money, some of which is recoverable, some of which isn't. And what's critical from our perspective is to not do something that is of limited or no value, and to be able to respond to changing technology. You know, we're in the first throes of this, and you know, you hear about a recurrence, and it might be in the winter, or it might be next year, and so it's a matter of being able to adapt to new findings, right? The CDC, I haven't read it yet, so I'm going out on a limb, but I've heard that they're a little less worried about the virus being able to be transmitted through metal now. So, you know, we all need to be smart and be efficient and prudent, because you could throw a ton of money at something and then be, why did I just do that? So, it's a lot of new abnormals.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Andy, that, you know, because it does seem that the information that we're getting from whether it's the government or the media, it's changing, you know, it changes all the time. I do recommend, just, you know, I'm sure everybody knows this already, but this, you know, the state websites and the CDC websites, there's just a ton of information on those, that, you know, with recommendations. And I know, as far as, you know, employee, you know, with respect to employees, if you go to OSHA, my recollection last time I looked, which I think was a few days ago, really directs you to the CDC website. And, you know, so I think a lot of the information is really on the CDC website. Talks about, you know, how to open a business, reopen the business, but like I said, you just have to keep looking at it, because it changes all the time.
Yeah, and so one of the legal mandates, speaking of the variety of government resources, is for posting and signage, not only mandatory posting and signage for compliance with social distancing and sanitation and the like, but also to the extent that new technology is being used or that people are subject to testing and screening mechanisms. There's quite a lot of legislative and administrative guidance on that front, so we just flag that for you.
And that, as I believe it was mentioned by Andy, he touched on it, that all these things cost money. And, making a building safe, putting in overhead infrared scanners, maybe extra security, staggered shifts, alternating how people come and they go and reconfiguring, all cost money. And so, some of it can be maybe passed along to the tenants, but I suspect that right now there's trouble, tenants, we represent tenants as well, and they're having trouble paying their rent. So this is going to be a bit of a capital investment, and there's various sources of capital that different landlords can go. Maybe Toby, you can just maybe touch on how how you see some of your the buildings that you manage, how they're coping with this, or how you guys are coping with this, the different.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me break this into sort of three categories. So the first category is around sort of just capital improvements.
And wait, Toby, before you get into this, because I was reminded, and I did not. I have to say this CLE code. So I'm going to. This is like an advertisement. The CLE code is SS as in Seyfarth Shaw 2291. That's SS 2291. I'm sorry, Toby.
Thanks, John. Good commercial. I hope everyone got that. So I'll sort of address this in three sort of categories. So one is just capital improvements to the building. Number two is operating costs of the building, and three is just around challenges people are having paying their rent. Again, overarching view to all of this is partnership, open communication between the landlord and the tenant, and also what we're advocating for is plans that are more sort of standards and procedural rather than heavy capital commitments and over long periods of time. And the comment earlier on about technology is exactly right. I think that the technology around this is evolving quickly and changing, and we're not sure whether today UV wands might be what everybody's still talking about, but should we all go out and buy lots of UV wands and then we're not going to use them tomorrow because the guidance changes? So I think that's sort of the overarching guidance. So on the capital side, we're not advising or advocating for any great capital expenditure to the building to make modifications and changes. And when you're on the topic of temperature checking, let me sort of talk to that from a tenant's perspective. So what we are advising all of our team members, all of our employees, is to take their own temperatures in the morning at home. If they're above the guidance of 100.4, then they should stay at home. And we've given them that flexibility. It's not their sick leave or anything like that. Second thing is when they log onto their computers, they're going to be asked to fill out a sort of a health check. And that health check is going to ask them sort of basic questions around how they feel. Again, a reminder of them. As a new parent, this is nothing new. Every day I take my son to daycare, and he has a health check, so I'm sort of used to that, or at least when daycare was open. So that's just on the capital side, and again that partnership. On the operating side, I mentioned earlier, there's going to be some increases. I think for this year, 2020, it's going to be a wash because expenses have gone down while we've been sort of out of the office, and then they're going to increase when we come back, and it's going to just be a wash on those two. Obviously, going into 2021, there's going to be an increase then, and I think that there's going to be agreement on what are the standards, what are the new standards around cleaning, what are the new standards around maintenance. All of those things have got to be decided on by the landlord as sort of the standard, following whatever guidance there is. But then there's got to be open sort of dialogue with the tenants. The last category about rent payment, so that's where I think a lot of these come in. What the advice that we've been giving to both our landlord and tenant clients is, if there is a challenge paying the rent for whatever reason, there should be a sort of a very transparent package of why, and then working towards how how you overcome that. We're not advocating that the landlord should be the lender of choice in those situations. There are multiple sources of capital that are available to tenants, and again, our sort of overarching guidance is, you have a lease that has certain obligations. You should fulfill those obligations. If you can't, then present a package to your landlord and have a dialogue about it. But absolutely just not paying your rent or thinking of your landlord as a lender of choice, I think is not necessarily the right approach, and not something that we are suggesting or advocating for. We're all in this global sort of pandemic together, and we've got to fulfill our obligations, but also have open dialogue of how we can solve some of these things together. And this is a good summary of some of the availability of capital out there.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Toby. And that brings us to our advertisement. Miles?
Yes, continuing our advertisement. I urge you all to go to the Seyfarth Shaw website, and there is a COVID response area, which leads you to a vast amount of areas where we have published materials and direct you to specific teams, be it teams that will help develop some of these plans for building reopenings, business reopenings, teams that deal with the financial side in terms of the CARES Act or PPP stimulus programs. We have people that are working on the landlord and the tenant side. How do we move forward? They need to work together, and it's not just the short term. We think it's going to be an 18, 24-month process. How do we get through this?
All right. And folks can check out the website. Do we have time for a question, Lori?
I think we do, and we've got a number of really excellent questions, and unfortunately not enough time to answer them all directly. And so to the extent we didn't answer your question today, we will reach out to you directly with that information and share that feedback. But I think we can fill in one here. And why don't we talk about how you're sort of handling the temperature check issue if somebody comes into the building and is hot through either these overhead scanners or from a handheld temperature check. What, from a practical perspective, are the landlords planning to do? And so, Toby, Andy, maybe you could share your thoughts on how a building ought to handle that.
So, Sandy, what we're planning on doing is asking anyone who's exceeding the CDC guidelines to basically go to the same desk where we otherwise have our visitor check-ins, and because the visitor has to go there anyway to register, that's not changing. And so if it's a person who's an employee of a tenant, we'd make sure that that employee knows, and the visitor, that assuming it's the case, that all of our tenants have asked us to let them know when someone is coming to their space who's exceeding the CDC guidelines, and really leave it to the tenant to decide how to respond unless they've given us really clear direction. We're not going to, at this point, we're not planning on doing a secondary temperature check, because that seems a little more intrusive than we think our tenants and even our visitors are going to want. Now, that may change, once this hits reality, but that's the current plan.
And Toby, what are you seeing?
So what we are recommending both for ourselves and for our occupier clients is, again, go back to that sort of collaboration with the landlord. What we would expect is that if one of our employees, one of our vendors, or one of our guests, if they were above the 100.4, then that would be a call that comes to us, and it's a situation that we should, the obligation should be for us to manage. So if it's one of our employees, it would come into our human resources team. We definitely don't want to put our landlords in a position where they have to deal with, an employee that's unhappy because they've been stopped, or they're sending them to get that second temperature check. So we absolutely, for ourselves and for all of the occupiers where we manage their space, we're advocating the responsibility there is passed firmly to the tenant to deal with.
Thank you. And I think we're out of time here, so John, I'll leave it to you to close us off.
All right. Well, again, I'd like to thank everyone who participated. Certainly thank our speakers, Toby, Andy, Dean, and Gary, for participating. Yet an expert panel. We will. The questions will be circulated, and to the extent we can get to it, someone may email you back with an answer. We wish to thank you everyone for participating. And the last thing I'll say, again, if you didn't get the first time, was the code SS2291. That's SS2291. Thank you, everybody, and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you all. Bye-bye.
This concludes today's webinar. Thank you for attending.